Well, good morning, everyone, and I'm so delighted to have you with us today, whether you are watching online or are in the studio or are here in the worship center at Preston Trail. I just love that opening introductory video. You know, the lush hillsides and green valleys point to the vibrancy of God's living creation, and the music bed that plays underneath it, it's pastoral in tone, and it harmonizes beautifully with the images that slip quietly through your mind's eye. And together, sound and sight warm our hearts as we read some of Jesus' most profound and enduring thoughts. Blessed are the peacemakers. You are the salt of the earth. You're the light of the world. Seek first the kingdom of God. Do to others what you would like them to do to you. And a man who divorces his wife causes her to commit adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery. What on earth is Jesus saying? It seems a bit harsh, uncaring, maybe even hurtful, and it raises indeed some very important questions. Is divorce always wrong? What if I'm not happy in my marriage? If I am divorced, can I remarry with God's blessing? What if I am divorced and remarried? Am I living in adultery? Well, this is indeed a heavy topic, and there are some big questions. And so I wanted to just kind of get a sense of how impactful this topic is. So I'm going to read several statements here. I don't want you to respond, but as I read through them, when I'm done, at the end, if any one of them applies to you, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand at that time. All right, if I could have just a little bit of house light so we can see, that would be awesome. So here are the statements. Were your parents divorced? Have you been divorced? Has anyone in your immediate family been divorced? Don't raise your hand yet. Meaning your children or a brother or sister. Have you dated or married anyone who is divorced? So if any one of those statements applies to you, would you raise your hand right now? Look around. That is almost all of us. Now, I recognize that today's message may indeed trigger or dig up some of the pain and hurt of some of your darkest days. And even though Jesus' teaching here in the Sermon on the Mount is not about recovering from divorce, my hope and prayer is that in this message today, you will find some help and some hope and a future. Now, here's one of the challenges that we do face in this. There has been and still remains much disagreement about this topic of divorce and remarriage, and what the Bible and Jesus actually teaches about it. For almost 2 millennia in the history of the church, neither divorce nor remarriage was permitted. Although there were some minority opinions, and more of those are emerging today, some people believe that divorce can be permitted, but the only option is reconciliation or a life of being a single. Others believe that divorce and remarriage are acceptable in the case of adultery or desertion or abuse. And still others believe that divorce and remarriage are acceptable in a variety of circumstances. Now, to understand, though, what Jesus is communicating here in the Sermon on the Mount, it's going to be important for us to remember 3 things. And I hope you'll keep these in mind. And a lot of these begin kind of at the front end of the sermon, but Jesus wants us to remember them as we go through the other parts. So here's the first thing. To really understand what Jesus is saying, we have to take Scripture seriously, and that means taking the context seriously. That is, the context is going to impact how we understand what Jesus is saying in a significant fashion. And we often realize that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, The Apostle Paul talks about women not coming to church without their head covered. I don't see any hats on any woman in the room today. So clearly we have determined that that was something that was contextually related to that particular time. And quite frankly, one scholar says that for a woman to come to worship with her head uncovered at that time would be the equivalent of you ladies wearing a bikini to worship today. That's what it was like. So context matters. Here's the second thing that Jesus talked about, and Paul talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Jesus did not come to abolish what the Old Testament teaches about divorce and remarriage, but to correct a misinterpretation of what, in fact, it does teach. And Jesus' teaching is going to be focused on this misinterpretation. And here's the third thing to keep in mind. Living righteously is the key to experiencing the good life in God's kingdom. Backing back up to verse 20 in chapter 5, here's what we read. Jesus says, "But I warn you, unless your righteousness is better than the righteousness of the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, Jesus is not addressing here the question who is going to heaven or who is going to hell, but who is able to experience this good life that is available by grace to all of us if we're willing to enter Christ's kingdom. Now, what does it mean to live righteously? N.T. Wright, probably the preeminent New Testament scholar in our world today, says that God's righteousness refers not just to his virtuous acts, but his acts that he does in fulfillment of his covenant promises. That is, we call God good and loving because he is a covenant keeper. He has a long history of keeping his word and his promises and his relational agreements with Israel and with us, and because of that, he is righteous. And so, in the same way then, we live a righteous life. We are good and loving when we keep our covenants, our binding relational agreements with God, with a marriage partner, with our employer, with employees, with our mortgage company, even with the HOA. And that's one of the hardest ones, but that's to live a righteous life means that you keep your covenants with people. And so, with these three things in mind, context matters, Jesus is correcting a misinterpretation, and covenant keeping is how we live a righteous life. Let's dig in. And here's the thing. We believe in the Bible. The Bible is our guide and authority. So I'm going to take you through some text today so that you can really understand what's going on, all right? I'm going to read some of these texts. I'm going to give you some assessments or some very quick judgments and go through them. But it's important that you hear these and know these, all right? So here we go. The first one is found in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. And this is the focal text in both the Old and New Testament around which a lot of the controversy kind of stirs. So here it is. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, and after she leaves his house and she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. Now, what in the world does that mean? And what is the law of Moses talking about? Well, here it is. In antiquity, men held all of the rights of divorce, and women, devastatingly, had none. And so if a man writes a bill of divorcement and sends his wife away, she only has three options. She can move back in with her parents if they're still alive. or brothers and sisters if they will take her. Other than that, she can basically become a prostitute, or she can get remarried. And this remarriage thing was something that happened on a regular basis. Remarriage by a divorced woman was not just permitted in that day, it was expected. That was how women were cared for. There was no labor market for women in that day. And so they would remarry. And as a matter of fact, one of the reasons is because the Jewish people took Genesis 1:28 very seriously, where God says, be fruitful and multiply. And so it was expected that everyone would be married and everyone would be having children. But here's the third thing. A certificate of divorce protected a woman from her first husband returning and trying to reclaim his wife and children from her new husband. Now, here's what was going on. In the cultures around Israel, men could divorce their wife, they would remarry again, and they would start a new family, have kids, but then the first husband would come back and reclaim her and take her away and all the kids and some of the property. And because that was legal, very few men would marry a divorced woman, so women were going uncared for. And so Moses' law here is actually a step up in the protection of women. Because what it did was it forbade a husband who sends his wife away in divorce and she remarries and she divorces again. He can't go back and reclaim her, so that men are more likely to remarry and care for women in that very brutal and very primitive setting. So that's Deuteronomy 24, 1-4. We'll come back to it. Now, the next one is Malachi 2, verses 15 and 16. And the prophet writes, so guard your heart, remain loyal to the wife of your youth. And here's a phrase we've often heard a lot. For I hate divorce, says the Lord, the God of Israel. To divorce your wife is to overwhelm her with cruelty. You see, what God understands is how difficult it was to be a woman in that day, and he was trying to care for women. Says the Lord of Heaven's army, so guard your heart, men. Do not be unfaithful to the wife of your youth, is what it says. And the background of that text is men were divorcing their wives that they took early in their life so they could have a trophy wife. And it was doing a horrible thing to those women. So here are two things from this text. God's will for those who are married is to keep their marriage vows. That is God's perfect will. And second, God's heart breaks for the pain and anguish that breaking marriage vows causes for women. But in our day, not just women. Holly McKay is one of our fine leaders for our divorce care ministry. I had a conversation with her this week, and I said, tell me, how does divorce impacting people in our world today? And she said, it impacts every aspect of life. The couple, their children, their extended families, their friends. It injects grief and loss into their lives in ways they never expected or ever understood. It injects anxiety. They become socially isolated, especially the women. They experience financial stress and the loss of identity roles. Now they're having the complexity of co-parenting challenges, and many of them are depressed, and there is a loss of self-esteem. And when that occurs, God's heart breaks. That's why Malachi says God hates divorce, not divorced people. He hates what divorce does to people that he loves. So if you have been walking through a divorce, and if we could serve you and help you, our divorce care ministry is available to you on a weekly basis. If you haven't downloaded our app, please do. Under the first page you get there, it says Get Help. You can click on that link and you can go to a care and support group, and you can find how you can find help in your recovery from divorce. Those are two Old Testament texts. Now, to the New Testament, we have the practice of any cause divorce in Jesus' day. And that's in quotes because that is actually something that was happening. So here's what was going on. There was a great debate spurred by the meaning of the phrase, something indecent, that we read back in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. And there was a disputation between two prominent rabbis who lived about 70 years before Jesus. One was Rabbi Hillel, who focused on the word something. And he taught that a man, if he became displeased with his wife for any kind of reason, he could just write her a bill of divorcement. It could be something like burning the toast or not having the house clean or getting one too many wrinkles. He could divorce her for any frivolous reason. And here's the deal. If you were a woman in that day, disaster was one piece of burnt toast away. That's what it was like. On the other hand, there's Rabbi Shammai, who focused on the word indecent. And he taught that a man could divorce his wife only when she did something that was sexually immoral. Now, the prevalence of what became known as any cause divorce, that is what Hillel was saying, hey, any old cause, you can divorce your wife. The prevalence of this kind of divorce, in fact, you can find it in Jewish literature, that's actually what they called it, any cause divorce. This grew so quickly because why? Because men saw it as a workaround for adultery. Here's the thing. You're at work, there's a new intern. She's really good looking, a little younger. Hey, that's okay. And so you strike up a relationship. You know, your eyes meet, you know, the sparks are going off, and you go home and go, honey, you burned the toast this morning. Here's a bill of divorcement. I'm going to go, and now I'm going to marry this person. And that's exactly what was taking place. And Jesus is going, no. Hold on a second. You think because Moses permitted divorce in Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4, that means you can just divorce your wife for a frivolous reason and go and marry someone else? You are not getting around it. You are committing adultery. You're busted. And so what was taking place, this is the legal argument in the background of what Jesus is going to be addressing. So let's look at Matthew 5, 31 through 32 right now in the Sermon on the Mount and see what he says. You have heard the law that says a man can divorce his wife by merely giving her a written notice of divorce. But I say that a man who divorces his wife, unless she has been unfaithful, causes her to commit adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery. Now here's the thing. This is such a brief statement. And I cannot imagine Matthew editing down Jesus' statement so drastically unless every one of his listeners clearly understood the context of what was going on. Jesus here is not making a comprehensive statement about all possible situations about divorce or that cause divorce. He's not making a statement about abuse or neglect or abandonment. He's really zeroing in on this one hot topic. Those things are treated in other places in Scripture. Now, we get a hint of the fact that Jesus is really focusing on this when you turn to Matthew 19, verses 3 through 10. And in verse 3 of Matthew 19, here's what we read. Some Pharisees came and tried to trap him with this question. Should a man be allowed to divorce his wife for just any reason? That's the any cause question, and they're trying to get him to come down on the side of Hillel or the side of Shammai. And so in verses 4 through 10, what we read here is Jesus' response to this misinterpretation of the Old Testament law. So here we go. Jesus' teaching on divorce and remarriage affirms first, God's original intent for marriage can only be attained within an indissoluble commitment. Let me read verses 4 through 6 of Matthew 19. Haven't you read the scriptures? Jesus replies to these Pharisees. They record that from the beginning, God made them male and female. And he said, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. Now, Jesus here is referring to the institution of marriage that was kind of given birth in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. And then he adds to that text, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Now, Jesus does not quote verse 25 of Genesis 2 here, but here's what it says. Now the man and his wife were both naked, but they felt no shame. And this little verse outlines God's intent for marriage. Two people in a life-giving, intimate relationship in which they can be totally naked before one another, emotionally, spiritually, and physically, without fear of shame or rejection, knowing that the other person will not leave them for any reason. You see, what Jesus is asserting is that you can never get to this level of intimacy without each spouse having a rock-solid commitment to their vows. And if there is any doubt or hesitation that comes into one of the minds of the spouses, then intimacy begins to leak. Why? Because then we can no longer be certain that we're going to be loved or cherished or valued simply for who we are. Jesus is certain that the only way you can fully experience God's kingdom ideal for marriage is to have a righteous marriage. And by that I mean where both spouses keep their covenant. They keep their vows. Now, here's just a quick aside. This is why we do not encourage couples to cohabitate before marriage. Although at times it feels like Christians talk about this because we're afraid that people are going to have too much sex outside of marriage. But here's the deal. It is about more than just sex. It's about the whole relational arrangement, because it diminishes the experience of God's life-giving intimacy that he desires. Here's the way it often works. With every miscommunication, with every fight, every time you make love, you're always on trial. You're always up for evaluation. And you know your significant other can pull the plug relatively easy at any time. Therefore, you have to work hard at creating the self that you think your significant other wants and will accept, which is your false self and not your true self. And in so doing, you cannot be fully and shamelessly true to who you are. So you have to settle for an intimacy that falls short of God's good creative intent for you. And anytime we settle for less than God's creative intent, the Bible says that's the core definition of sin. For settling less than God's gracious intent for our lives. All right? So Jesus is saying, hey, listen, this hope for marriage can only be fully experienced when you are in a relationship where there is an indissoluble commitment to one another. Then he goes on to say that a hardened heart is the main culprit in a failed marriage. Look at verses 7 and 8. Then why did Moses say in the law that a man could give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away, they asked. Jesus replied, Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts, but it was not what God had originally intended. I think I speak for all of us who are married. When we said I do, we all started out with some tender hearts toward one another. But then life started happening and we can drift apart and little pools of anger can begin to pollute our hearts and we begin to focus on what our spouse is not doing for us and we become a little less understanding and more critical. And then we start keeping score and we express our feelings of contempt and sometimes it gets to the level of disgust and we become defensive and self-justifying and before long we are emotionally closed off. And the countdown clock to a failed marriage is ticking. It's no coincidence that the previous two topics that Jesus addresses in the Sermon on the Mount are anger and contempt and lust and adultery. Just think how much most marriages would improve if we could handle our anger and our contempt and our sexual minds and hearts. And Jesus is saying, it is a hard heart that creates brokenness. A hard, harsh, stubborn, and sensitive and cruel heart is the kryptonite of marriage. Jesus goes on, legal divorce proceedings do not legitimize adultery. And we're going to look at Matthew 19:9 for a moment here because there are a lot of implications for it. First of all, here's what it reads. And I tell you this, whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery unless his wife has been unfaithful. So Jesus is closing Hillel's rabbinic loophole. If you divorce your spouse for just any old reason so you can go and marry someone else, you're not only committing the sin of divorce, you are also committing adultery. But there are legitimate reasons for divorce in Matthew 19:9. And here's what Jesus says. You can divorce your wife and you can marry someone else if indeed your spouse has been unfaithful. Now, unfaithful is the translation of the Greek word porneia, which includes adultery, but can also mean many other kinds of sexual immorality. It could be pornography addiction or phone sex today or sexting. Any sinful activity that divides the marital relationship. Jesus is saying, on that basis then, you may divorce. He's not encouraging you to, but you may, and you may remarry. And then the last implication of this is those who divorce their spouse for legitimate reasons are free to remarry. Again, I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness and marries another woman commits adultery. What he's saying is, if your spouse breaks the wedding vow of sexual fidelity, then you can remarry. But here's something I also want to note. Jesus does not negate Deuteronomy chapter 24, which recognizes that someone who is divorced by a spouse for an illegitimate or a frivolous reason may also remarry. So that if you are, and there are rarely innocent persons in a divorce, but if you are the offended one and you are divorced for a non-biblical reason, I believe Jesus does not negate that Old Testament teaching and you may remarry. That's a lot. Now, what in the world is Jesus trying to do and what does he want us to understand today? And here it is. The underlying purpose of Jesus' teaching is to warn his listeners that their misguided view of divorce and remarriage, the any cause divorce, is causing them to miss the life-giving intimacy that God intended for them in the beginning. You see, Jesus is less interested in all the iterations of the case law that was just occupying the Pharisees and scribes all the time. Is it okay to divorce here? Can you get remarried here? Jesus, he's not trying to address all those. He wants to help us maintain and restore the original purpose of marriage. So how does he do that? Well, Jesus, in this text, he identifies the kind of spouses who will experience a life-giving, intimate marriage. You want to know those? I hope you do. They're really important. So here's the first one. If you want to experience the intimacy in your marriage that God designed from the beginning, both spouses must guard their hearts and keep them tender toward one another. It's incredibly important. As a matter of fact, in the letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the Ephesians, here's what he says. He's applying it to all believers, but I think it especially applies to marriage. Here's what he says. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, harsh words, and slander, as well as all types of evil behavior. Instead, be kind to each other, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, just as God through Christ has forgiven you. Now here's something to note. Paul says, just do it. Get rid of all of it and start treating people differently. Treat your spouse differently. Paul recognizes that each one of us has the capacity to change the way we relate to other people, especially our spouses. But here is the key, that last phrase, just as Christ has forgiven you, is the secret to a tender heart. You want a tender, forgiving heart for your spouse? Just keep track of all that God has forgiven you for. Do you want a more loving heart for your spouse? Just remember again how selflessly God has loved you. Do you want more patience with your spouse? Just get in touch with how patient God has been with you in your life. And when you begin to factor all the ways that God has responded to you so graciously, so lovingly, so patiently, then it becomes incredibly easier to treat your spouse in that way. The key to experiencing a long-term, life-giving marriage is to guard your heart and keep it soft toward each other. And here's the next one. Spouses who keep their vows even when it is extremely challenging. These indeed are the kinds of people who will experience God's life-giving intimacy that He wants all of us to experience. But here's the thing. When marriage gets hard and difficult and unhappy, it is increasingly easy in our culture to pull the plug. And let me say, I think God has a special place in His heart for husbands and wives whose spouses have been wayward and unfaithfully, who stay and fight for forgiveness and restoration. Now, several years ago, I found this graph I want to share with you guys. And it's a graph based on several studies about marital happiness during childbearing years. And so you see, we all kind of start out up here, man, marriage is awesome, it's great. And then we start having kids, the childbearing years, and we kind of take a dip right here during the preschool years. I call that preschool purgatory. I was in it. I had some real struggles and temptations personally in it. Thankfully, my wife was gracious and loved me through that. But that's difficult. Well, then when they start going to elementary school, things start getting a little bit better. That's awesome. But then they grow into teenagers, and there you are in the depths of marital hell. If you're a teenager, you're here today, your parents love you. It's all worth it. But here's the deal. If you can hang in there, if you can avoid the temptation, if you can hold on, then look what happens. Then you get to experience all that God wants for you in marriage. Here's the thing. You know, being married through those child rearing and career building years can feel like you're running a marathon. And you will hit walls. You can see the walls right over there. And at times you will hurt all over. And you will start thinking how good it might feel to stop. You'll struggle at times to even think of a reason why you must finish the race. You're still a decent person. You can just step off the track and never give it another thought. But you would. You would always give it another thought. What might have been, what would it feel like to have finished? There is a thrill in holding on to the finish line that those who drop out too quickly will never experience. When I look at this graph, I think at the bottom there, on the bottom of what we went through in the 20th year of our marriage. It was a season of long and stressful hours at work. We were raising three teenage sons. There were unspoken and unmet expectations. My sweet wife was struggling with clinical depression. She had no energy in her life to care for things. And it took a toll on my heart. And it got really hard. And I lost any desire to be with my wife. And even though I never said it out loud to anyone, I started thinking, how much longer do I have to stay in this, and when can I get out and pull the plug? Though I didn't feel like it, for the sake of the covenant that I made, we did the hard work of counseling. And we had a breakthrough. And our hearts were tender again. And these last 27 years have been the best years of our marriage. I shudder to think what I would have missed if I had pulled the plug. I would have missed family gatherings at Christmas and Thanksgiving, celebrating grandkids with my wife. I would have missed Preston Trail. I would have missed you. And I was talking to Robin about that on the way to church. And here's what she said. It's not like Jesus wants you to be miserable. He just knows what's on the other side. And that's why you become a covenant keeper and you keep your vows. So let me ask you a question today. And I want to guide you through a time of prayer. I don't know what your situation is. You may be single and you hope to someday be married. You may be happily married. That's wonderful. You may be struggling in your marriage right now. You may have been divorced and you're married. I don't think it matters where you are or what's gone on in the past. What God wants you to do is to begin today to be a covenant keeper right now. So if you would allow me to guide us in a time of guided prayer, close your eyes and bow your heads and have an open heart. I want to call out some things. If they apply to you, I encourage you to give your heart and life to what God is leading you. So even in this moment, is your heart hard toward your spouse? If so, I encourage you to do a deep dive into God's undeserved grace that He's given to you. Let His grace flow into your life. Soften your heart. Maybe you're dating and engaged, and you need to have a conversation that divorce will never be on the table. That's how you can be a covenant keeper right now. Or maybe where you're sitting, you're hitting the wall in this marathon called marriage. I want to encourage you to reach out on our app. There are counselors there that you can find under Get Help. Re-engage is an incredible ministry that helps. Be a covenant keeper by seeking a breakthrough and help. Your intimacy may be leaking right now in your marriage, Because whenever you fight or have disagreements, you throw out the D word, divorce. Just agree with one another. From now on, you will never do that. Because it is not an option as a follower of Jesus. Maybe for you to be a covenant keeper today, you need to call the person you're having an affair with and tell them it is over. Do it today. For you to be a covenant keeper may mean that you tell a safe person about an emotional attraction that you're struggling with and you get it out in the open. For you to be a covenant keeper today, you might need to call your attorney tomorrow and withdraw the divorce petition. For you to be a covenant keeper today, if you're divorced, get your heart healed and renew your commitment to being a covenant keeper as you think about the future. Maybe you're in a second or a third marriage. Forget the past and say, God, under your grace, I will be a covenant keeper from here on out. Heavenly Father, you know the hearts and the story of everyone within my hearing. And I pray that as they open their heart and spirit to you, that you'll give them wisdom and discernment and courage and a willingness to be a covenant keeper as they never have been before. In Jesus' name, amen.